Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Almighty God, we ask your blessing as we resume our Bible study after a 2-month hiatus and sabbatical and pilgrimage. May your Holy Spirit be with us to remember what we have read and to help us ponder the scriptures that we will be reading moving forward. All this we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so today, a little recap. We left off finishing after 2 weeks reading parables from chapter 13 of St. Matthew's Gospel. You can revisit all of that if you choose. All of those things are on video on our church website. But as we go forward, we're going to start today with 2 videos because they match up nicely. We're sort of at a midpoint in St. Matthew's Gospel. The Gospel itself is 28 chapters. We're starting chapter 14. And so there's a bit of a shift that goes on right here. And conveniently, our 2 video sources, the Bible Project overview of the whole book cartoon thing, which is 7 minutes, starts at chapter 14, I believe. And the other one, which is the 2 Yale professors, they also speak about chapter 14. So we're going to start with that, each of those videos, and then we'll do one of them, read 14, and then do the other one if that works. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
And from their point of view, Jesus...
Well, that's not right. Let's try again. Okay.
The Gospel according to Matthew. In the first video, we saw how Matthew introduced Jesus as the Messiah from the line of David, and as a new authoritative teacher like Moses, and also as Emmanuel, which in Hebrew means God with us. After Jesus announced and taught about the arrival of God's kingdom, and after he brought the kingdom into day-to-day life among the people of Israel, we saw that Jesus was accepted by many, but rejected by others, especially Israel's religious leaders, the Pharisees. And so the big question is, how is this conflict between Jesus and Israel's leaders going to play itself out? The next large section, chapters 14 through 20, explore all the different expectations people have about the Messiah. So Jesus keeps healing sick people, and twice he even miraculously provides food for these huge crowds in the desert. One's made up of Jewish people, and the other is a non-Jewish crowd. And this sign, it's very similar to what Moses did for Israel in the wilderness. And so all these people are excited about Jesus. They think he's the great prophet and the Messiah, but not the religious leaders. Their view of the Messiah is built on passages like Psalm 2 or Daniel chapter 2 about a victorious Messiah who's going to deliver Israel and defeat the pagan oppressors. And from their point of view, Jesus, he's a false teacher. He's making blasphemous claims about himself. And so there are stories here about them increasing their opposition, hatching a plan to kill him. And so in response, Jesus, he withdraws, and he begins teaching his closest disciples what it means for him to be Israel's Messiah, because it is not what anybody expects. So Jesus asks his disciples, chapter 16, he says, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter comes up with the right answer, it seems. He says, "Well, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." But then it becomes clear that Peter's thinking about a king who's going to reign victoriously through military power. And Jesus challenges Peter, saying that, yes, I am going to become king, but through a different way. And so Jesus starts to teach on themes from the prophet Isaiah, who said that the Messianic king would suffer and die for the sins of his own people. And so Jesus, he was positioning himself as a Messianic king who reigns by becoming a servant, and who would lay down his life for Israel and the nations. Well, Peter and the disciples, they mostly just don't get it. And so Jesus enters into the 4th block of teaching, followed by a series of teachings after that. And these are all about the upside-down nature of Jesus' messianic kingdom, which turns upside down all of our value systems. So in the community of the servant king, you gain honor by serving others. And instead of getting revenge, you forgive and do good to your enemies. And in Jesus' kingdom, you gain true wealth by giving your wealth away to the poor. to follow the servant Messiah, you must become a servant yourself. In the next section, we watch the two kingdoms clash, Jesus' kingdom and that of Israel's leader. Jesus comes to Jerusalem for Passover riding in on a donkey, and the crowds are hailing him as the Messiah. And Jesus immediately marches into the courtyard of the temple, and he creates this huge disruption that brings the daily sacrifices to a halt. His actions speak louder than words here. As Israel's king, Jesus was asserting his royal authority over the temple, the place where God and Israel met together. And in Jesus' view, the temple was compromised by the hypocrisy of Israel's leaders. And so here he's challenging their authority, and naturally, they're deeply offended. And so they try to trap Jesus and shame him in public debate, and they fail. So they end up just determining to have him killed. In response, Jesus delivers his final block of teaching. He first offers this passionate critique of the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, and then he weeps over Jerusalem and its rejection of God and his kingdom. Then Jesus withdraws with the disciples, and he starts telling them what's going to happen. He's going to be executed by these leaders, but in doing so, they're going to create their own demise, because instead of accepting Jesus' way of the peaceful kingdom, they're going to take the road of revolt against Rome, and so Jerusalem and its temple are going to be destroyed. But, Jesus says, that is not the end of the story. He's going to be vindicated after his death by his resurrection. And one day, he'll return and set up his kingdom over all nations. And so in the meanwhile, the disciples need to stay alert and stay committed to just announcing Jesus and his kingdom and spreading the good news. And so with all of that ringing in the disciples' ears, the story comes to its climax. That night, Jesus takes the disciples aside and he celebrates a Passover meal with them. The Passover retells the story of Israel's rescue from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And then Jesus takes the bread and the wine from this meal as new symbols, showing that his coming death would be a sacrifice that would redeem his people from slavery to sin and evil. After the meal, Jesus is arrested. He's put on trial before the Sanhedrin, a council of Jewish leaders, and they reject his claim to be the Messiah. They charge him with blasphemy against God. Then Jesus is brought before the Roman governor Pilate, and he thinks Jesus is innocent, but he gives in to the pressure from the Jewish leaders, and he sentences Jesus to death by crucifixion. So Jesus is led away by Roman soldiers and crucified. Now, you'll notice right here in this section that just like Matthew did in the opening chapters, he increases the number of references to the Old Testament. He's trying to show that Jesus' death was not a tragedy or a failure. Rather, it was the surprising fulfillment of all of the old prophetic promises. Jesus came as the servant Messiah, spoken of by Isaiah. He was rejected by his own people, but instead of judging them, he is judged on their behalf, bearing the consequences of their sin. So the crucifixion scene, it comes to a close, and Jesus' body
Matt,
is
could
placed
you speak
in the
louder
tomb.
because you
But
need
the
to
book
speak
ends
over
with
the
a surprising
narration that's
twist
going
the
on
last
with the
chapter. The disciples, they discover on Sunday morning that Jesus' tomb is empty. And then all of a sudden people start...
I'm not speaking. We're watching a video. So is that okay, Charlotte? Yeah, okay.
seeing Jesus alive from the dead. And the book concludes with the risen Jesus giving a final teaching called the Great Commission. Jesus says that he is now the true king of the world. And so he sends his disciples out to all nations with the good news that Jesus is Lord and that anyone can join his kingdom by being baptized and by following his teachings. And echoing all the way back to his name, Emmanuel, God with us, from chapter 1, Jesus' last words in the book to his disciples are, "I will be with you." It's a promise of Jesus' presence until the day he finally returns. And that's the gospel according to Matthew.
Now I'm speaking. Can you hear me? All right. So we're going to read chapter 14, but before we jump into that, any comments on that chunk of the video? I think it's a nice overview. All right. Let's read 14, and then this gives us three rather, very big and not entirely related stories, but as our friend in the Bible Project just said, this is the beginning of talking about what type of kingdom Jesus might be bringing. So I'll share my screen and okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Barbara, since you're unmuted, can you read the death of John the Baptist?
At that time, Herod the ruler heard the news about Jesus. He said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. This is why these miraculous powers are at work through him." Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of Herod's brother Philip. That's because John told Herod, "It's against the law for you to marry her." Although Herod wanted to kill him, he feared the crowd because they thought John was a prophet. But at Herod's birthday party, Herodias' daughter danced in front of the guests and thrilled Herod. Then he swore to give her anything she asked. At her mother's urging, the girl said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a plate." Although the king was upset because of his solemn pledge and his guests, he commanded that they give it to her. Then he had John beheaded in prison. They brought his head on a plate and gave it to the young woman, and she brought it to her mother. But John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus what had happened.
Great. Okay. Any comments on this section? I have a couple. First of all, this closes the loop, so to speak, on the John the Baptist narrative in St. Matthew's Gospel. It was just kind of left open at one point, and one of the things that this does in terms of the overall narrative is it does distinguish even the Jewish leadership, which Herod was officially the king of the area, and puts them, the civil leadership, into the same category as people against Jesus or John the Baptist. It also provides the death of John the Baptist and does link him through Jesus with this opening line that John the Baptist is working through Jesus. The story of John the Baptist, for what it's worth, is basically told if you read all four Gospels, you'll get a full picture of John the Baptist. We don't have time to do that today, but I did do that at one point with the in-person Bible study a couple of months back. And I do recommend it. It's pretty easy to just go into Bible Gateway or something like that and literally Google John the Baptist, and you can read the full story, and you'll get some slight differences in every gospel. But in Matthew's Gospel, this sort of closes the loop on his life. Any comments on this or feedback? Okay. If you had been to the Holy Land at some point in the past or recent future, this may have taken place at Herodian, for what it's worth, this scene. It might not have, but it may have. And it depends on what time of year. This theoretically could have taken place there, or Caesarea, or Masada, or in Jericho, or in Jerusalem. But so if you've been there, you have some idea of where it might have been. All right. Charlotte, you've got your hand up. Is it for anything?
Yes. No, I'm sorry about that. What happens is there's another recording that's playing as this is going on, and it's really overshadowing what's happening. So it's difficult for me to follow.
I don't understand. There's another recording?
Yeah, I know. There's another recording. Evidently, maybe one of the other sessions, but it's playing. So maybe it's not playing on yours, but it's playing on mine. So
Yeah,
maybe I'll go out and come back in. Let me go out and come back in.
You probably have two things open. You probably have two.
That's what I'm
windows
figuring. I'll go out and come back in.
Yeah, you're probably
Okay.
listening to me preach on the YouTube channel. Well, when she comes back, it's still going to be there, but we'll tell her. All right. I was going to ask Charlotte to read, but Edda, you're unmuted. Can you read the reading of the 5,000?
Sure. When Jesus heard about John, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. When the crowds learned this, they followed him on foot from the cities. When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion for them and healed those who were sick. That evening, his disciples came and said to him, "This is an isolated place and it's getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, "There's no need to send them away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here except 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." He said, "Bring them here to me." He ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, looked up to heaven, blessed them, and broke the loaves apart and gave them to his disciples. Then the disciples gave them to the crowd. Everyone ate until they were full, and they filled 12 baskets with the leftovers. About 5,000 men, plus women and children, had eaten.
Great. Okay, a couple of things. If you remember the video, he said that the first feeding of 5,000 is for Jewish people. The second is for non-Jewish people of 4,000. I think that's in the next chapter. And the distinction is not clear here. It is clear when we read the feeding of the 4,000, and it has to do with where it happens. So the assumption is this is just a group of people that Jesus had been with. Let me deal with Charlotte. Charlotte, do you still hear the other thing going on? Yes, no? Do you still hear the other thing going on?
Okay, yeah. I think I came out, but I didn't come out enough. I'll come out.
No. The problem is that you've got a browser open and it's auto playing. Somewhere you've got Safari or whatever browser you use open on your computer, and it's auto playing off of the website. I'm sure that's what's going on. If you can hear me speaking about something else, there she's gone again. All right. Well, anyway, all right. This is going to be a great recording when this comes back. Okay. The other things about this which are worth noting is there is some very clear imagery that links to the Eucharist, right? In the Last Supper, the same language is used about the blessing of bread and that sort of thing. There are 2 words that are used in Greek. One is give thanks, which is Eucharist, and the other is bless, which I think is eulogo or something like that. And they're both used in the Last Supper narratives. And when we get ahead, I'm going to guess, but when we get ahead, it wouldn't surprise me if in the feeding of the 4,000, it says give thanks rather than blessed, so that there is some links here to this. Actually, we can check. Let's see. I think it's in the next chapter. Let's see. Feeding of the 4,000. Yeah, I'm right. He gave thanks, right? You see down there? So it's interchangeable in the 2. And the idea is that if you're noticing these words after you've read the gospel, you'll be like, oh, the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, was there any Eucharistic or Last Supper references there? And the answer is yes. And when we jump, and I'll show you this too right now, when we jump to the actual Last Supper, which probably is in 26, 20, yeah, I think it's 6. Let's see, Last Supper. So when he's at the Last Supper, okay, he takes bread, he blesses it, he takes a cup, he gives thanks. If you look in other gospels, those words are used as well, but sometimes they're in slightly different places. So at the Last Supper and in the Eucharistic prayer, those words pop up, obviously in English, but in Greek, every time you see blessed, when he takes bread or blesses it or blesses something or gives thanks, there's sometimes, and especially in the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000, is a link back to the Last Supper, which is kind of neat. So something to keep note of. Back to 14. Isn't the internet great? You can just jump around. Anything else about the feeding of the 5,000? 5 loaves and 2 fishes?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
Etta.
it says it's about 5,000 men plus women and children had eaten. So is it actually more than 5,000 or are the women and children counted in the 5,000? I know it's a stupid question, but
No, it's not. It's the way it reads is the way it would read in Greek too. It's 5,000 men plus women and children. So it's 10,000? Who knows?
yeah.
Right? Like, so why is it 5,000 men? I don't know. It's worth, while we're here, it's worth
Well, I
looking.
don't think women and children counted. So the
Well,
men count.
they might not have counted in the same way, but it is worth looking at
Hmm.
the feeding of the 4,000 to see if it's phrased the same way. Yeah, it's phrased the same way, right? And feeding of the 4,000, it's a different number, right? 7 loaves and a few fish, 4,000 men plus women and children. And so it's similar but different. But that's something if you look at the feeding. So the feeding of the 4,000 shows up in, this is one of the things, like Jesus's baptism, like the crucifixion, that shows up in all 4 gospels. And so you can actually take a look at how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all narrate the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew and Mark provide a feeding of a 4,000. I'm about 95% sure that Luke does not, and I know that John does not. And each of them deal with the feeding of the 5,000 in a very similar way. But I believe in some of the Gospels, it's 5,000 people were there. And in Matthew, it's 5,000 men plus women and children. And that may be for just tightening the narrative. It may be how they viewed whether women and children counted in the same way or not. It may be so, but this is another, like the John the Baptist material, this is another scene that is really worth taking the time to read in the other Gospels. And there is a book that I have that is really overly expensive, but and I have it in Greek too, but can you see my book? This is called the Synopsis of the 4 Gospels. You can find these things online for free, but what it does is, let me see if I can find it. What are we in, Matthew 14? So what it does is it will take a scene such as, can you see that? The death of John the Baptist.
Wow.
And it will compare it in all of the Gospels. And you'll note in one Gospel, it's blank. So that's probably John, right? So in John, that scene is not narrated. And the feeding of the 5,000 right there is in all 4 Gospels. I don't know how much this book costs, but you can buy these books for fairly cheap if you search online. This one is very expensive, but it's a companion to the Greek version of it that I have as well. It's a useful tool to have. Sometimes they're called, it's not the same thing as a gospel parallel, or a scripture parallel, because sometimes you'll get a thing that has multiple translations all next to each other, and that's really useful too. But what this is taking each scene and laying it out in all 4 things. If you want to look for this specific book, it is I don't know what it's called. It's just called Synopsis of the 4 Gospels, and this is a useful book to have on your shelf if you're ever interested in looking through these things. But that's where you'll see things like, oh, in this gospel it says gave thanks, in this one it says blessed, and you begin to see as you compare them all that they're all kind of doing the same thing. They all saw the links, and they all try in a fairly light-handed way to make sure that there are some obvious links to the Last Supper. There's also some obvious links to things like Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd. He makes me lie down in green pastures. in all the Gospels, there's this clear idea that it's grass, and that sort of thing. Yeah, those of you that have been to Israel in the spring know that there is in fact grass. Those of you that have been in the summer didn't see any grass. So, so if we were guessing on a time, we would guess spring. And we actually don't have to guess on a time if we put all the Gospels together, because in St. John's Gospel, the feeding of the 5,000 happens at Passover, which is in the spring, right? So again, if you read all of the Gospel narratives, you do get a much fuller idea of each of these scenes. It can be dangerous to put them all together and say this is exactly what happened, because sometimes they're telling things in a slightly different way. And so you get a duplication sometimes of things, or you get details that don't match up. So in its context, it's worth remembering that Matthew is I think, very specifically linking here to the Eucharist. And when we get to the feeding of the 4,000 and he uses gave thanks, you think, oh, okay, he used both of the words, blessed and gave thanks, that he uses in the Last Supper narrative. Which is kind of neat. And then things like the 12 baskets, maybe that links to the 12 tribes, who knows, right? There's, but the miracle itself, you'll hear sermons sometimes on this. Oh, this is such a nice story. They all came out and they shared. That's not what the text says. The text says that it was a miraculous feeding of 5,000 and it's very clear. We have no food. Like, there's nothing to share. All we have is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And you'll note that adds up to 7. Did you catch in the feeding of the 4,000? It was 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. So the numbers, interestingly, are the same, even though the count is different. All right. Anything else on the feeding of the 5,000?
No.
All right. Walking on water. Jim, can you read Walking on Water?
Yes. Okay. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up onto a mountain by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from land. Very early in the morning, he came to his disciples, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." They were so frightened, they screamed. Just then, Jesus spoke to them. "Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened. As he began to sink, he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You men are of weak faith. Why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's son."
Great. Okay. So a few things. Any idea what lake we're on? Probably the Sea of Galilee, most likely.
Yeah.
And the mountain, if you've been there, one of those places around it that are hilly. So they go out and they hit a storm, and Jesus shows up walking on the water. One of the purposes of this, there's a couple of purposes of this story, I think. One is there is there's a kind of overt reference to Genesis, if you know it. He's the same word in Greek is as ghost is spirit. And if you remember the first couple of lines of Genesis, the spirit moves over the water, which is kind of interesting that it's there. And if you also remember Genesis, the Jesus, there's the chaos is all in the water and that sort of thing. So this is one, maybe oblique, not overt, oblique reference, I think, to Jesus, like in Genesis, has control over the chaos and the waters and that sort of things. There's also a very clear, this is another one of those stories that people that don't like miracles will be like, oh, there were rocks and he walked across the rocks. And that's not what it says. It says he walked on the water. And if you are not sure of that, then Peter going out and sinking gives you the same idea. So there is a miraculous walking on water here. And there are some references to Genesis and God having power over chaos and water and creation and all of this. But I think the point of this is this part where Peter goes out to walk on water, and you get a pretty clear confession from the disciples, or whoever is in the boat at least, of who Jesus is. But it follows right after that their faith is not really correct. And we'll see this again when Peter, in a couple of chapters, confesses Jesus as the Messiah, and then he sort of gets it wrong. Remember when we watched the video, they were like, the man in the video said, they're going to start confessing Jesus, so they're on the right path. They're at least not, saying he's not the Messiah like the adversaries are, but they still don't have it right. And so the next chapters as we go forward are going to begin to be a corrective of this weak faith and doubts, because their view of who Jesus is either incomplete or incorrect, even though they're on the right path. Does that make sense? Like they recognize that Jesus is God's son. Peter will later recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, but his understanding of what that means is still wrong. Make sense? It's like kids in math, right? I've got kids in math. It's like getting the right answer, but showing your work and it's all wrong. like you miraculously got there, which is nice, but you didn't really understand how to do the problem. So, any comments on any of this? All right. Healing the sick. So as we've seen a couple of times, we end these sequences with mass healings. So JD, can you read this last little chunk?
When they crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret. When the people who lived in that place recognized him, they sent word throughout the whole region, and they brought to him everyone who was sick. Then they begged him that they might just touch the edge of his clothes. Everyone who touched him was cured.
Great. So if you look up Gennesaret in a map, and I'm going to do it right now, let's see where Gennesaret is. Can you still see this if I jump over to here? Can you still see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We see the Bible Project.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's look where Gennesaret is. Map. All right. Up on the Sea of Galilee. Right. Well, Gennesaret. Map of Gennesaret. Let's see where they think it is.
Will it
Kinneret.
open? It won't open?
No, I haven't clicked on anything.
Oh,
There we go. It's the Sea of Galilee is also called the Lake Tiberias, Kinneret. That's another word for Gennesaret. Kinnereth. So there's a bunch of different. Anyway, it's on the Sea of Galilee. Let's see if we can actually get a town. There it is, Kinneret. You see that right there?
yes.
Where is it?
Kinneret.
Okay.
And at the bottom to the
Okay.
left.
This is a modern map for what it's worth. I mean, when we were there, right? Remember Tagba? That's the loaves and the fishes. Actually, this is very useful to take a look at. So we were there, right? So
Right.
we went to Capernaum.
Mhm.
We were at the Jordan River, which you can sort of see it up here. We were up here. We drove to Capernaum. We walked through there, and then there we go. There's the Jordan River. Do you see it winding in?
Yep.
And then we went to Tagba. That's where the loaves and the fishes is. And so if they were up here, which they might have been, and then they took a boat around or down, Kinneret is down here, which would be where Gennesaret is. So as I said earlier, we didn't know exactly from the context where they were when Jesus fed 5,000. By the end of it, it seems pretty obvious that they were floating around the sea, no pun intended, floating around the Sea of Galilee. And when you get you get different towns that are named around here, and so you can see some of these. But loaves and the fishes, right? Why is this called the loaves and the fishes? Because what do they think happened there?
The loaves and the fishes.
The loaves and the fishes, right? So this is where the tradition connects feeding of the 5,000 to, and somewhere in here, I have, oh no, it's in my house, but I've got one of these things. So they go from here down to Kinneret. The other tradition, if you remember the church that was here, for those that went there, there's a church called the Primacy of St. Peter. That was the one that was, this is where the beach was. Do you remember when?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where the beach is. It's right next, there's like two places right next to each other. So there's the church with the rock, and then right next door was Tagba. And so they're right near each other. So they were in, and this is Capernaum, where Peter is from. This is the general area where a lot of this ministry is going on, but they're also down here as well. So they're kind of all over the place. They're at Tiberias at one point as well. And there's other towns over here also. So yeah, well, anyway, so next week we will, as I said, I've got to get going, unfortunately, for 2 meetings at the exact same time, which should be fun. But next week we will continue and read chapter 15 and begin to get a sense of how these scenes turn into some teaching scenes. But we'll get the feeding of the 4,000 next. And I hope that in the interim, between now and then, if you're looking for something to do, you could read up on John the Baptist, or you could read the different feeding of the 5,000 or 4,000 narratives and go from there. Or I'll show you one other thing before I go. You could go on to our website. I think it's still there. And go to Bible study. And all the way at the bottom is this commentary on the Last Supper. I deal with some of the feeding of the 5,000 things, I think, in this. Let me double check. I think that I deal with it. So this is, oh yeah. Well, take a look at this if you want. There might be some feeding of the 5,000 stuff in that. But all right, any questions before we run off? All right, good to see you all. It's good to be back and awake bright and early at 8 a.m. for Bible study. So God bless. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you. Take it. Bye-bye.
Bye.